Hello and welcome to episode 47 and 48, Impact of NATO's Enlargement and the Future of Europe. It has always been a question of defense and security when it comes to the current Europe's affairs. And I believe we have discussed a few of the episodes in which we have briefly mentioned about the role of NATO in certain events, especially in Russia-Ukraine war as well. But we haven't really taken a constructive criticism path as well as, the good side as well of the defense and security efforts, especially through the NATO that are taking place in Europe. So today, to take a deep dive into this topic, we have with us Dr. James Goldgeier. Hi, James. Welcome to the
Hello, how are
podcast.
you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great. So yeah, I'm glad to really have you on the podcast. Firstly, because I read
Thanks.
a lot of your articles. I mean, it's the first time I saw a very critical commentary and a detailed analysis which was thoughtfully given about NATO. And I hope to, kind of extend that discussion during this podcast.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yes. So yeah, before we take a deep dive into the topic, can you tell us briefly about yourself, your background, your journey in this sector, and how you ended up being what you are as a one of the prominent experts in this domain?
Well, I've been interested in NATO for a long time. I've been interested in U.S. European relations for a long time. I did a senior thesis in college on NATO's nuclear doctrine. And that goes back many, 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 many years. And then moved away from it a little bit, but I worked in the U.S. government in the mid-90s, and I came out of that experience wanting to write about something that I hadn't worked on directly, but that was of great interest to me. And I ended up writing a book that came out in 1999 on the U.S. decision-making process leading up to the first round of NATO enlargement post-Cold War, the inclusion of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in March of 1999. And it was a very controversial decision. There were a lot of academics who didn't like it. I learned from my interviews there were a lot of people in the U.S. government who were unhappy with that decision and policy for a variety of reasons. And so I just became interested in the role that NATO enlargement could play in European security across the continent with former communist countries. And then also interested in sort of trying to think through what it would mean for U.S. Russia relations, the West's relations with Russia more broadly. And I can't say I thought I'd still be writing about these issues in 2023, but NATO enlargement has remained, of course, an important topic. And so it's one that I keep coming back to.
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, this is a great start, I think, you gave from your journey itself. So, how has NATO's enlargement affected the security landscape in Europe from your perspective?
Well, at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. And there were big decisions that had to be made about how to address the new set of issues that were arising in Central and Eastern Europe and in Russia and the rest of the countries that emerged from the Soviet Union. And the guiding ideas in the United States, anyway, were that, and this was the George H.W. Bush administration. I mean, the central animating idea was that from a U.S. perspective, that the United States had joined the fight in World War I, had left Europe at the end of World War I, and then there was a World War 20 years later. The United States, of course, deeply engaged in ensuring the victory of the Allies in World War II, and as it had been in World War I. And that the United States then made a decision after World War II to stay in Europe and to try to ensure the security and stability of Western Europe in the face of the Soviet control of Eastern Europe. And so at the end of the Cold War, in the Bush administration, despite the fact there were a lot of people saying, well, why do we still need NATO? Because after all, the Warsaw Pact, which it was, its main adversary during the Cold War, has disappeared. Maybe we don't need NATO anymore. And the Bush administration felt that those lessons of the 20th century, that, the US leaving Europe had been bad for international security, and that the US staying in Europe after World War II had been good for European security, that the United States should stay engaged. And the only way to do that was through NATO, because the United States is not a member of the European Union, for example. And it was viewed that what was then called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and is now the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, would be too weak for this. And so NATO was seen as the vehicle for continued US influence in European security, and as a way to reach out to the Central and Eastern Europeans. And so that began the effort to think about what was the best way to engage with the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and how could NATO engage with Russia. And that was really what animated the alliance during the 1990s.
Interesting. I think the one important point you mentioned was about the vehicle of influence in the European security matters. So from that perspective, and I believe every nation on this planet has their priorities for the national interest, and that's where the geopolitical drivers come in. So what are the main geopolitical drivers behind NATO's expansion in Europe?
Well, you have both the interest from the West and the interest from the East. So first of all, it's hugely important to understand that the Central and Eastern Europeans desperately wanted to join NATO. I mean, they'd been on the other side of the Iron Curtain. They were on the wrong side of the dividing line the Soviets drew in Europe. They didn't get the chance to live freely like the West Europeans did during the Cold War. They didn't get the chance for that prosperity. They wanted to be in NATO and the European Union. And, partly it was wanting to join the West and be part of the West. Partly it was because their fear that Russia might reemerge as a threat one day, as it in fact has. So they were eager to join. From the Western perspective, the question was, how do you ensure security and stability across Central and Eastern Europe? And this was a big issue in the early 1990s. There were concerns about whether German unification, for example, would lead to a more powerful Germany that, might create problems for its neighbors, given the historical record. But most importantly, there was the war that had broken out in the former Yugoslavia. And there was a fear that type of violence that emerged in the former Yugoslavia could emerge elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. And so there was a feeling that bringing those countries closer together to NATO, first through something that was called the Partnership for Peace, that was an effort to engage the militaries of Central and Eastern Europe, and then later on putting these countries on a path to NATO membership, that would create the kind of security and stability in Eastern Europe that we had seen in Western Europe after the end of World War II. So that was the impetus from both sides, and then you had the remaining question of how was that going to affect relations with Russia, and there were huge efforts on the part of the West to try to reassure Russia that this wasn't directed at them, and the West took a number of steps. NATO took a number of steps. The U.S. took a number of steps, including reducing the number of troops that it had in Europe, all to try to assuage Russian concerns, which was a very difficult thing to do, and certainly contributed to a deterioration in the West's relations with Russia. But I don't believe, and we can get into it if you want, I don't believe it was the only reason why problems emerged between the West and Russia.
All right. And, just to mention this point out of curiosity as well, because we have recently seen Ukraine, and there are several other nations which have been, uh, are, I would say, an aspiring members to join NATO. So, how does aspiring nations who want to join NATO, such as like Ukraine, Georgia as well, view their potential membership's impact on their security? Because I believe the way Russian dominance has been acted on on these countries uh, is has not been so great, for their cooperation. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So, the challenge has been as NATO has moved across Europe and incorporated more and more members. I mean, NATO at the end of the Cold War had 16 members, and it now
Yes,
has 31. And when Sweden joins, it will have 32. So it will have doubled in terms of the number of members since
yes,
the end of the Cold War. And as it's moved across Europe, um, we've seen two things. We've seen security for the countries that have gotten into NATO. They are much safer and more secure than they would be if they were not in NATO. And we've
yes,
seen an increasing antagonism with Russia. And that really, now centers on Ukraine, where Ukraine, it's important to remember, prior to 2014, when the Russians invaded Ukraine at that time, there
yes,
wasn't a lot of enthusiasm among the population of Ukraine. There wasn't a lot of interest in joining NATO. It wasn't seen as hugely important for Ukraine, which sat there between the West and Russia and was looking to try to have good relations with both.
yes,
And the 2014 invasion changed that. The Ukrainians realized, oh my goodness, Russia has taken part of our territory, has designs on more territory, and the only way we can be safe is if we join NATO. And so then you had much greater interest in joining NATO on the part of Ukraine, and
yes,
a lot of reluctance in the West. I mean, the West wasn't really up until February 24th of 2022, when Putin expanded the war in Ukraine, the West, had paid lip service to the idea that Ukraine could and even would join NATO at some point, but that it wasn't really a live issue for NATO. But the expanded invasion has changed that conversation, where there's much greater thinking about the importance of bringing Ukraine into NATO in order to protect it from a continual cycle of Russian aggression against the country, and a deterrence of Russian aggression in the way that Russia is deterred from attacking countries like Estonia and Poland, because those countries are members of NATO. So the dynamics really prior to February 24th, 2022 were not really any kind of real movement on trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. And now the question really is, can it be done? Can the war end? If the war ends, can it be done when the war ends? There's still a lot of debate about it, but certainly the Ukrainians are very eager because they want the security. They don't want to keep facing the prospect of continual Russian military aggression.
yes. I mean, this is a very good point you mentioned, giving a context on the historical things as well, because even I have seen that the interest of Ukraine's, potential membership in NATO, this aspirations actually started from, past decade only, more and more, I would say. But before that, I'm just, kind of comparing in a global political level, where a country like Ukraine and a country like even Qatar, this like Qatar is even a lot smaller, in size. But even though such a small country, one thing they did right was strengthening the diplomatic ties, which I believe even Ukraine could have done. back in those days, of course, when they got separated from Russia. So what are your thoughts in general? This question is really out of your curiosity, because I know that you really have an amazing critical thoughts on such issues. So do you think, like, if Ukraine would have strengthened its diplomatic instruments uh, since long time, I mean, not now, but since decades, then the situation might would have been different, actually?
Well, I think, again, prior to 2014, Ukraine was trying to develop good relations, both with the European Union and with Russia. It understood the situation that it was in, and there were periods, in the 2000s and certainly in 2013, 2014, early 2014, when it had leaders who were decidedly pro-Russian and wanted to ensure a good relationship with Russia. But I think even for the leaders that were more desiring of a closer relationship with the West, they understood the position that they were in. So I think that the real issue is the Russian unwillingness to accept the borders that became internationally recognized in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia became an independent country.
Yes.
It has internationally recognized borders, and Ukraine is a separate country. It is an independent country. Its borders were recognized in 1991 as well, and it has sought the sovereignty, like any country. It has sought to have sovereignty over the territory that it is recognized to have. And the Russians haven't accepted that. The Russians believe, certainly Putin has made clear that he believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia. And so it's kind of hard to live as a neighbor, a small country as a neighbor of a big country that thinks you belong to it, and that is willing to use force
Yes.
to try to achieve that goal. And keep in mind, this is the main reason the United Nations was founded in 1945, after the events of the 1920s and 1930s, and of course into the 40s. The UN was founded on the idea that large countries should not be able to cross borders with military force and take territory from their weaker neighbors. That's what had occurred in the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
And that was what the UN was designed to prevent, that countries would agree you don't do that. And when, for example, in 1990, when Iraq invaded its neighbor Kuwait, the international community joined together, and in 1991, the United States and other countries went to war against Iraq to ensure that it left Kuwait and that Kuwait returned to being a sovereign, independent country. And it's the same principle here. The Russians invaded, and this is a total violation of international law, of agreements that the Russians themselves had signed over the decades. And this is the central problem. This question of, can Russia, whose 1991 borders, it's a big country. You look at the borders,
Yes,
they got a lot of. It doesn't seem like they need more territory.
That's
they
true.
apparently feel that they do. And until they are willing to live within those 1991 internationally recognized borders, we are going to have a problem.
Yes. And just to look at it from the other lens of Russia, I would say, in what ways has NATO's enlargement influenced Russia's foreign policy and its relationship with the West?
Yeah, this is certainly a hot button issue, and there are certainly lots of people who believe that NATO, through its enlargement, provoked Russia. It's hard one of the challenges of thinking through this issue is that from Russia's perspective, there were a number of things that happened between, let's say, 1999 and 2004 that were of great concern to Russia and its conception of its security. So you had the first two rounds of NATO's post-Cold War enlargement in 1999 and 2004. 3 countries came in 99 and another 7 in 2004, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which the Russians had occupied and forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union. At the same time, the first round of post-Cold War NATO enlargement in March of 1999, at the same time, there was also the NATO war against Serbia over Kosovo, which was of much greater concern to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who was very angry about this attack on a Russian ally. 2002, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the Russians feared would have a negative impact on their deterrent capability. They were upset about that. They were upset about the United States going to war against Iraq in 2003 without UN Security Council authorization. And then in 2004, you had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, changing government, and the Russians believed that the United States was behind it and that, they were coming after the Putin regime next. And so it's hard to disentangle NATO enlargement from all these other issues from a Russian perspective. Meanwhile, you had the increasing authoritarianism in Russia itself that was becoming of greater and greater concern to the West. But I think when it comes to NATO enlargement, my view is that the Russians had largely accepted those first 2 rounds of enlargement, and they didn't like it, but they were accommodating to it. The problem came in 2008. NATO had a summit in Bucharest in 2008, and the George W. Bush administration was trying to put Ukraine and Georgia on a more formal path to membership through what were called membership action plans. The French and Germans opposed this, and there was a compromise language in the NATO summit declaration that said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. So the problem was, it was a statement that really antagonized the Russians. I mean, this was viewed as very provocative, and it was something that the then ambassador to Russia, U.S. ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns, who's now the CIA director, this was something that he was warning against from Moscow, that putting Ukraine and Georgia on a path to membership would be very provocative.
Yes.
So he had this statement that they will become members of NATO, but they weren't really put on a path. And so what you had then in the years that followed, and remember, Russia went to war with Georgia in August of 2008. What you had was this situation where NATO's stated policy was that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. But as I mentioned earlier, they weren't put on any path. There really wasn't any real prospect that they were going to join. So that combination created a huge amount of insecurity for those 2 countries. And I think, created the options for Russia to try to ensure that they would never join those institutions. As I said before, Ukraine, really up until 2014, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm among the population of Ukraine for joining anyway. And so if Russia had not attacked Ukraine, I don't believe we would still just have that empty statement from 2008 probably, but it wouldn't mean anything and there wouldn't be any real discussion. Ukraine wouldn't be on a path and there wouldn't have been the interest in it. And Russia created it through the military aggression, the invasions of Ukraine and the war with Georgia.
Yes. This is a very interesting point you mentioned about a current CIA director, William Burns. I believe a lot of his statements that he made previously have been true in terms of foreign policy, politics, because the kind of I think the research that he brings in, it's really valuable, and I actually didn't know that he even mentioned about this thing as well. The NATO's enlargement. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's an important point as well, because we are coming to kind of a larger part of that discussion now. So what are the challenges and benefits of integrating Balkan states into NATO, and how has this impacted regional stability? Because we have seen issues like Kosovo, which keep on and off igniting, I would say, on a lot of levels. Even we see Bosnia as well. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, before I do that, just one last thing on Bill Burns, since you brought it up.
Yeah.
He wrote a memoir called Back Channel, came out a few years ago,
Okay.
2018, I think, maybe. And he he filed requests to get a number of his cables and memos that he had written while he was in government declassified, and they're up on the website of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There's where he used to be the president. There's a book website, and a couple. What we know from his from both the book and what he put on the website is that he was writing memos back home to Washington from Moscow in 2007, 2008 about this issue of Ukraine and Georgia.
Okay.
On the Balkans, yeah, you have a situation where we've seen a number of countries join NATO, Albania, Croatia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro,
Yes.
and we also have you know we have countries that and Slovenia, and Croatia and Slovenia, members of the European Union.
Yes.
There's the same effort there to use NATO and the European Union as institutions that can try to create stability in the region. It is complicated because of the 1999 war that NATO conducted against Serbia to protect the population of Kosovo, the continued tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, the continued Russian meddling in the region. And Russia continues to have close ties with the government in Serbia. And so I would say this project, there's a mixed record of this project. For countries like Croatia and Slovenia, it's been huge. Their ability to join NATO and the European Union has meant, that they've been able to make tremendous progress over the decades.
Okay.
And meanwhile, there's still these tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, and it's these were huge flashpoints in the 1990s, and you had the Balkan Wars,
Yes.
and you had a lot of U.S. attention in the region. The U.S. attention is elsewhere now, so there's not as much attention in the region. The European Union, of course, is hugely interested in stability in the Balkans, but there's no question that there's been a very mixed record of with some countries being able to make a lot of progress and other countries being held back for a variety of reasons, and still, especially with respect to the European Union being in limbo. And, in the case of Serbia, really a lack of progress in moving forward with that relationship.
Yes. And I mean, this question is again, out of my curiosity and research that I thought would be great to kind of put in over here, is because Turkey is one of the NATO members, I believe, whose interest a lot of times, don't really align in terms of what the European nations have in common in terms of decision making. So, what role does Turkey play in NATO's expansion, and how does this affect the alliance's dynamics?
Yeah, what an interesting issue. So complicated. Turkey, because of its location, is hugely strategically important for NATO. There are a lot
Yes.
of people who get very frustrated with Turkey. There are a lot of people who, I mean, you have President Erdogan in Turkey, who, has moved that country in an authoritarian direction, and
Yes.
it's it is a it has a very difficult relationship with the West. He has his own, he has his own interests, and he has sought to position Turkey more between the West and Russia.
Yes.
He's sought to have good relations with Russia, although he's also been very supportive of Ukraine in
Yes.
this war. So it is really complex. He's played a role in the in the initial establishment of a grain deal between Russia and Ukraine. He also has for the export of grain. He also has a lot of interest in the Caucasus, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. He's Turkey plays a major role in the Caucasus as a major player. He's got a major interest in Central Asia. So it's a major actor. It often Turkey is at odds with its Western partners,
Yes.
particularly in the in the relationship with Russia. Turkey held up the Finland's accession to NATO for a long time, but then allowed that to go forward, and we're still waiting for Turkey and Hungary to approve of Sweden coming in. So there's no question it's difficult, but NATO is a consensus-based organization, so it can
Yes.
only operate with consensus. So it needs all of its members to be on the same page when it wants to move forward. And people complain, oh, we should be kicking some members out of NATO. Well, there's no provision for that. A member state can give notice if it wants to leave, but if it doesn't want to leave, it's there. There's not a
Yes.
provision to kick a country out. So I
Yeah.
think you got to have a situation where the West has to work as best as it can with this government in Turkey, and try to move forward where it can, recognizing that Turkey is going to frustrate the West at moments, as it has over the recent years.